This workshop's part of Kapanu, a project that colleagues and I here at Brighton are involved in. Kapanu stands for the Cartography of the Political Novel in Europe, and it's a project funded by the EU and by UK Research and Innovation. And the project and its title prompts many questions. What is the political? What is the novel? What is Europe? And what does it mean to map things? So we've had plenty to think about as we've been engaging in this. With colleagues from universities across Europe, we've been exploring the relationship between politics and novels. We've been asking about how novels intervene in political debates and how they relate to power more broadly. And our project has also precipitated broader questions about the relationship between politics and fiction. What role do fictions play in politics? How are social and political orders maintained, reproduced, and contested through fictional means? Political fictions that colleagues are exploring on this project range from ideas of citizenship, borders, and sovereignty, fictions that shore up particular oppressive social orders, through to contrapuntal fictions, both conceptual and narrative, through which dominant orders are contested. And the political fiction with which we're, of course, concerned today is the fiction of the family. Families are often at the centre of fictional works, from ancient texts like Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannus, where Freud saw the Oedipus complex acted out, through the unhappy families of the 19th century novel, to contemporary works, including the complex sisterly relationships of Julia Armfield's Private Rights, which takes place in the context of paternal inheritance, property relations, and climate crisis. The stories people tell about themselves often begin with their families, and families are sustained and reproduced through the stories they tell or don't tell about themselves. Our keynote speaker today, Clare Hemmings, has recently written about the ways in which family stories reproduce and conceal structures of gender, class, and racial privilege. And ideas of family are closely related to fiction and power, to narratives of self and world, to ideas of belonging, identity, and inheritance. A particular conception of intimate life, a heteropatriarchal model of the family, characterised by a binary gender order, a gender division of labour and male dominance, has been a key fiction through which imperialism, settler colonialism, and racialised capitalism have flourished and been reproduced across recent centuries. The fiction of the family, the idea of its naturalness and properness, shored up by religion, has been a key mechanism of European and global North hegemony, and the violent suppression, erasure, and marginalisation of other ways of being, kith and kin, and doing kinship. As many scholars, including Melinda Cooper, have noted, recent decades have witnessed the revalorisation of the nuclear family model as the primary site of care and social reproduction in the face of neoliberal privatisation and the retrenchment of welfare states. There has been, in the words of Angela McRobbie, a return of gender traditionalism in response to the contradictions between caring responsibilities and waged work at this conjuncture. Today, those on the right, often with authoritarian agendas, mobilise fantasies of a nuclear family imperilled by gender expansiveness, queer sexualities, and reproductive rights to bolster oppressive structures of power. Exclusion from the heterosexist and white supremacist nuclear family, both historically and today, particularly for queer communities and those of colour, has led to a flourishing of ways of doing and being family otherwise. And family can take diverse forms that are not necessarily related to blood ties or to child rearing. Alexis Pauline Gubbs has read the polymaternal structures of care common to some communities of colour in the USA as both queer and revolutionary, because they undermine both sexual and social norms and illustrate that mothering as a practice is not tied to biological relations or the family. Mothering is then not restricted to the care of children. As Audre Lorde famously affirmed, oppressed communities must learn to mother ourselves. And these accounts imagine the family otherwise, creating alternative fictions of and for the family that exceed and challenge its hegemonic form. Today, on the left, family abolition has become a shorthand with which to name and critique the inequalities and insecurities of privatised reproduction and property, and a horizon for social transformation. Michelle O'Brien has insisted, however, that this horizon must extend beyond alternative models of kinship whilst family diversity and chosen family offer modes of reprieve, she suggests, they are not ultimately adequate solutions to our collective crises of care. O'Brien argues instead for the communisation of care as a means of ensuring that everyone's care needs are met. Today, engagements with and critiques of the family increasingly take literary form, as fictional texts explore the effects of dominant ways of organising care and intimate life, and imagine different ways of doing and being family. And O'Brien's work is instructive here again. Her speculative novel, Everything for Everyone, An Oral History of the New York Commune, written with Emin Abdul-Hadi, employs a speculative mode to think through how we might take care of each other otherwise. And the work foregrounds the relationship between fiction and politics. In the words of Chandra Mukherjee, speculative works draw people away from common sense reality towards alternative political worlds. O'Brien and Abdul-Hadi use fiction to contest the dominant fiction of the family, mobilising the imagination to precipitate social change. And the work illustrates something vital to this workshop and something with which many of our presenters today are concerned. So we have a really wonderful range of work being shared today through these talks and panels that we're going to be listening to that explore the connections I've just briefly outlined and more. Our presenters insist on the political importance of fictional texts and the fictional character of politics, centering in all their forms political fictions of the family, for different kinds of family, and against the family, as part of a shared endeavour to understand and transform the ways that we live together and care for each other. And I'm very excited to engage in this work with you today, and I thank you all for coming and being part of the conversation. As you'll know from the programme, we have parallel panels, a creative writing workshop, an author roundtable with wine this evening. Lunch is going to be at 12:45 in Edward Street next door. We will endeavour to help you get there. It's a bit of a windy way, but we'll make our way. And during lunch, we have an art exhibit from Sebastian of some sculptures around themes of chosen family. So thanks so much, Sebastian, for that. I'm sure we will enjoy looking at that. Now, in a moment, it's my pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker, Clare Hemmings. Clare is Professor of Feminist Theory in the Department of Gender Studies at the London School of Economics, where she's worked since 1999. And Clare's research spans feminist and queer studies, and she's particularly interested in thinking through the relationship between these fields, as well as the ways in which both have been institutionalised both nationally and internationally. And this interest has led her to think about how participants in these fields tell stories about their history, as well as their current form, and to explore how such stories resonate with rather than against conservative agendas. And that's something I think is particularly important at this moment. Why Stories Matter, the Political Grammar of Feminist Theory, was published by Duke University Press in 2011, and it explores how feminists tell stories about the feminist past and why these stories matter and what we can do to transform them. Clare has also recently been gathering family stories for a project, Inheritance, a memory archive, which engages questions of gender, sexuality, class transition, and nation. Combining fiction and memoir, the project foregrounds the moments in family dynamics that challenge what we think we know about gender roles, sexuality, and citizenship. And I think we're going to be hearing something related to this project today. Clare's now beginning work on a new project on feminist knowledge struggles, telling stories differently, where she proposes translatable methodologies for a range of queer feminist projects to intervene in the political uncertainties of the hostile present. These methods include reciting a feminist history of sex that incorporates materialist, radical, black, and decolonial interrogations of sex as a site of struggle, and exploring affective dissonance as a universal condition to underpin solidarity politics. And I think this is really vital work at a time when gender and sexual politics are so contested and under attack. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Clare and to thank you for coming to speak to us today.
Thanks so much for that generous introduction, and thanks very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here in this rather nice room, actually, with this lovely view that I get to look up at. And I'm looking forward to engaging with you all over the day. I'll speak for about 50 minutes. some of it is story, so you won't hopefully go back to sleep. It's called The Genre of Inheritance, Dancing with Grandma. My mum always told Grandma's story to me and my older brother Julian in exactly the same way. She would start by reminding us what a fabulous dancer Grandma had been. All the men in the small South Wales village she grew up in were in love with her because of her flashing, midnight blue eyes and impossibly long legs, Mum insisted. She could stay up all night, a different partner for each dance till dawn. Flo was a wild one, a real beauty, who didn't give two hoots what people said about her. She met Grandpa, Reg, the policeman from the neighbouring village, when she was arrested along with the other girls, trying to snatch some fun at the social club. Drinking was illegal in Wales on Sundays, Mum told us, and so Grandma must have been caught with a tipple in her hand. Grandpa bailed Grandma out, vouched for her otherwise good character, and they were married within the month. They moved from South Wales to the south of England, and the rest is history, Mum would say, smacking her lips with satisfaction. So begins my short story, Grandma Was a Dancer, which follows the many incarnations of my maternal grandma Flo through the stories other people tell about her. It's a story of generation, class and gender, a way of telling multiple and sometimes competing stories that resist straightforward memoir, let alone history writ large. My mum tells the story of Grandma's grand romance to my brother and me, both of us wrapped in the breakfast room of our 1930s stucco house on the outskirts of Brighton. It's the 1970s, and in keeping with this supposed era of sexual freedom, my brother and I long for the story's glamour while being delighted with its familiar, reassuring contours and nostalgia. My story continues. I loved this tale of Grandma and Grandpa, and I regularly begged Mum to repeat it. I appreciated what I now know was the perfect narrative arc as we moved from restrictive Welsh hills to the sophisticated south of England. Grandma's arrest and release recast my now frail grandpa as a leading man, and old photos on the mantelshelf at Grandma and Grandpa's house confirm the centrality of her beauty to the story's momentum. The story made sense too. There was still something of the leading lady in the way Grandma styled her bright white hair so carefully every morning and never wore the same clothes 2 days straight. She had 2 full sets of daytime clothes that could be mixed and matched for any occasion. Grandma loved to show off the row of dresses robed in tissue in the upstairs landing cupboard that she never wore. She had made all of them herself, she said proudly, except this one, gently pulling out an exquisite light coral coloured silk dress cut on the bias. This one was a gift, she added with a wink. It is a story of Grandma that allows her to be simultaneously old and young and casts her as the heroine in a historical romance that moves across space as well as time. Grandma is so glamorous and so adventurous, and though she must have told this story 100 times, the pride in my mum's voice is undimmed. She loves telling this story of geographical and romantic transition. While Mum tells the story, I wait for the denouement, holding my mum's hand hard as we follow Flo's unfolding fortunes. Grandma moves from Wales to England, from labouring class to respectable class, from single to married life, from her home to ours. My mum's tale of Grandma captures my youthful imagination. It allows me to enter a realm of fantasy outside of my own childhood experience. When my brother and I stayed with Grandma and Grandpa, I took every opportunity to sneak into the landing cupboard and sit on the floor in the middle of the row of Grandma's dresses, touching one with careful fingers, rubbing a cheek against the fabric of another, long or short, beaded or plain, heavy or gossamer light, the dresses felt and smelled of a different time and place, and I wanted to be there. I made up stories about the occasions Grandma would have worn them, imagining myself her beau. Do be careful of the step flow, I'd say, helping her out of a hackney carriage, or I'd remove my silk-lined cape with a flourish, floating it over a puddle so that Grandma wouldn't have to get her feet wet, and even more importantly, to protect the pearl satin slippers she was wearing to go with that coral dress. This time, Grandma was a princess, and my prince's chivalry would always ensure she was home safe and sound well before midnight. I was tender and solicitous, like Grandma must have been, and she was light-footed and appreciative in return. We didn't need anyone else, but reflected each other's attention back to one another in a timeless dance as I whirled her around and around and around. Mum's telling of Grandma's story gives me the chance to inhabit a romance narrative, craft from the detail of movement, sequins and light, and to try out different ways of bringing the past into the present, calling on Grandma to recognise her queer grandchild as potential suitor. Listening to my mum's tall tale in the 1970s and now in the 2020s, I still want both to participate in these reassuring narrative arcs of gender and sexuality, and also to imagine other ways of telling and experiencing those same stories. Heteronormative history can't keep me from playing all the different parts. I'm not the only child listening to my mum's stories of her mother. My brother is there too, and as we hit adolescence, we work together to embellish the stories my mum gives us. I recreate this rare intimacy between my brother and I in Grandma as follows. Over time, my brother and I grew bored with Mum's tale, at the strained narrative that saw Grandma arrested with that drink in her hand and Grandpa so innocently falling for her that very night. We allowed that she would have indeed been the belle of the ball, waiting for the right tall handsome stranger to rescue her. Grandma was a fabulous dancer with those eyes and those legs. But we reset Grandma's story at the shadowy edges of this historic Welsh scene. Less airy public houses with enthusiastic young women wanting a bit of fun, more filthy dark corners of working men's clubs and the opportunity to make a bit of extra cash. Or we moved Grandma to a set of private rooms in the nearest town, owned by wealthy Londoners, heavy red velvet curtains and shabby, ornate corner lamps casting salacious shadows. These gentlemen, with their expensive cravats and smiles, paid well for a personal dance, but they easily turned nasty. On a good night, our Grandma would make enough to give a week's rent to her mum, handing over what was left after paying the bartender or the security out front, and keeping just enough back for a couple of feet of silk. Julian and I unrolled our story out over the top of Mum's version, rolling our eyes at each other when she started on again about what a fabulous dancer Grandma had been. In Grandma, my brother and I forge our counter-narrative together at my mum's expense, returning perhaps Flo's knowing wink. We craft our own stories from the raw material of our mums and grandmas, working with the restlessness of the original tale, pulling brutally on its frayed edges. While my own childhood storytelling imagined me Grandma's beau, my brother and I tell an equally queer tale of generational poverty and sexual labour, though we're not quite sure what story we're telling. We fashion our Grandma into a cool girl rather than a chorus girl, a dancer, inverted commas, whose navigation of the English predates her move to the south of England. Yet Grandma and Grandpa always end up together, no matter the narrative route they take. Grandma was a dancer is part of a larger project in which I work with my immediate family's memory archive to tell different stories about gender, class and national belonging than those we are typically presented with. It is the intersubjective nature of history that attracts me to this archival work. Hearing, as we all do, competing stories about our own lives and those of our families, we learn ways of navigating the differences among them. We learn early on to make sense of past and present, and then develop the skills necessary to imagine a future that differs from the present we inhabit. A memory archive thus foregrounds the subjective and desiring nature of adjudication, which story one settles with or embellishes, as at the heart of how history is experienced and embodied. Marianne Hirsch's work on generational transmission is instructive here. She invites us to embrace family memoir and storytelling as deeply effective forms of connection and disconnection that have the capacity to make rather than only respond to history. I take up her invitation, albeit in the very different context of my white class transitional family, to draw out the unsettled nature of the past and hence open up possible, though as yet unrecorded, futures both within and beyond the family. The embellishment of the tales I am told is thus central to my memory archive, not just because of the limits of the formal archive, though that's a key issue, as Saidiya Hartman so richly demonstrates. What she terms critical fabulation is an essential part of her desire to engage pre- and post-slavery black life as more than its brutal representation. My interventions take a very different track. It's the sexual and gendered feelings and plots through which the white class transitional aspirations of my family are expressed that are the central focus for this project. I fictionalise to draw out of the memory archive the underbelly of progress narratives of class and whiteness in the UK, foregrounding forms of displacement and violence that stories of aspiration tend to obscure. I fictionalise to explore the possibilities for emphasising multiple histories as a serious feature of inheritance. I fictionalise because this is how families navigate their relationship to one another, within and across generations. I fictionalise, in other words, because I always have, we always do. It feels impossible to gather the stories that form the fabric of the present otherwise. I repeat fictionalise here to distinguish this speculative work from the actual writing of fiction. I'm working with the imaginative threads that I believe are necessary to provide a fuller picture of the ways all of us navigate family tales and histories that we inherit. I'm not writing either fiction or history outside of this investment in challenging dominant narratives of sexuality, gender and class that an engagement with my memory archive enables. I've come to think of this method as generating what I call empirical fictions. I make things up as a way of characterising how the past enters the present in narrative form and how we spin yarns of our own to find ways of living with the past. Searching for Reg. Growing up, my maternal grandma and grandpa were a consistent presence in family life. We saw my paternal grandparents much less frequently, and when we did, I could never quite shake the sense that we were a too noisy interruption into the quiet family life they had made for themselves in Kent. Despite that, when starting this family archival project, I had to confront the fact that the most visible evidence in the archive was related to my paternal grandparents' history. My dad's father, Bill, had saved birth and death certificates, job references and war memorabilia, photographs and receipts in a small leather suitcase. My mum's family fortunes were less carefully preserved. residing in the repeated stories my mum told, in the tales that gestured and buried as well as revealed. So too in the extensive census data, parish and court archives, probate or military archives, the evidence base privileges my dad's family. They stayed in one place. They were more established in their class transition. They did everything properly. The archive then pushes me firmly towards telling the history of my paternal legacy precisely because of that respectability that brooked no rowdy interruption, while my body memories are of my maternal family and the stories my mother told us about them. So I started this project already suspicious of the archive, not only for its absences, but also for its transparent detail that does little to help me grapple with or understand the embodied attachments, smells and tastes of family that are a primary mode as well as outcome of affective inheritance. That suspicion of archival presence works in another way too. While the stories my mother and her grandmother were told were vibrant ones of economic migration, war survival and bitter sadness, as well as increased respectability, these stories are also gendered in significant ways. Grandma ruled her household roost, we were told, while Grandpa was a more distant, less loquacious presence, always at the edges of the scene. The tales told about my Grandma Flo are myriad, while those told about my Grandpa Reg are scant. In thinking with stories of Grandma, I was presented them with an excess of possibility, much of it contradictory. I resolved the differences within and across competing tales by letting the stories swell. Applying the same method to Grandpa would have meant Reg barely got a story at all. My grandpa was not forthcoming about himself, and what we heard about him rarely moved beyond minutiae. He was a policeman. He had an argument with his brother that he took to the grave. He liked making macaroni and cheese. He spent a lot of time in the basement with his tools. Fragments barely numerous enough to make a narrative arc. Yet despite the appeal of staying with Grandma's rich narration, I came to want Reg there too. While not knowing much about Reg, quote unquote, has its feminist pleasures, especially with such a glamorous protagonist at our story's heart, Flo, that unevenness also reinforces gender's heteronormativity, of course. Wives tell stories, as we know, while their husbands put up with them. I wanted to flesh out the bare bones of these stories about my maternal grandparents and make Reg responsible for his own script for once, forcing him out of his role as Flo's sidelined and put upon foil in the misogynist histories we more usually inherit. I wanted to know what Reg was doing in that basement and what he was thinking when he boiled the pasta and rummaged around for the cheese grater. I needed more character development for Reg if he was going to be more than a straw figure whose place I could imagine taking in wooing Flo. So as Flo's and Reg's romance narrative wore thin, I pieced together a gritty story for Grandpa drawn from 1970s and 80s realist dramas rather than the historical romances of my youth. These fictionalisations draw on labour history and the brutal treatment of the Welsh working classes by English landowners, as well as the small details that resonate from within the stories I inherit. Reg was a policeman, a good job for a man from a poor South Wales family whose interwar alternative was the brutality of coal or metal mining. His dad had lost a leg in 1913, the result of an ultimately lucky mining accident, since it saved him from death in the trenches. Reg's dad was a hero among the local men, as he'd organised effectively to keep Sunday prohibition intact, knowing the English envoys who spoke so easily of the right to pleasures for the working man, were talking out of the wrong side of their mouths. Union busting and strike breaking were more like it, he insisted, recoiling instinctively and politically from oily Tory speechifying. Reggie's dad knew, of course, that coal mining would kill them all in the end, and before his accident he had dreamed of moving the family north to the Doggethley gold belt, hoping Reg would pick up the mantle. But Reg had always been such a bloody disappointment. Reg was happy above rather than underground. His lanky frame was better suited to it, and he relished the cold, damp air. He could walk into warmth. The steel in his boots rang out his rhythm as he walked around and between neighbouring villages. He liked being a policeman. It gave him the authority he was otherwise refused. Reggie's job was mostly to break up brawls between men who drank their paychecks the weekend they got them. Usually his uniform was enough of a deterrent, but if it wasn't, he happily joined the fray. He thought of these fights as a valve for letting off steam and rarely arrested anyone. It was the same story Reg told the women who asked him for help after a domestic. Give him time, love. He loves you really, pet. Don't make him feel small, he said. Reg took the payouts from the public house or club owners to turn a blind eye to Sunday booze and came down hard when the cash flow was interrupted. One of the policemen would order a whiskey, drink it down in one, and then make the signal for the others to descend with a show of force. A few punches, some broken chairs, and the pouring out of the liquor into the drain was usually enough to ensure the right attitude next time they came around. Social realism allows me to give a context for Reg, situate him in a family of his own, as well as temperance and union history in the harsh environment of industrial and rural Wales. This fictionalisation resonates with tales my mum told me about Reggie's right-wing politics and conservative commitments that departed from his father's, but were far from unusual in the white English suburbs of post-war London. Indeed, one of the abiding themes of my memory archive is the importance of right-wing, class and land-dominant politics for our white, Welsh, class transitional family to belong. So too, there is a sense here of the Reg who is most himself in his enjoyment of a solitary task. Here, walking the Welsh hills in all weathers, later, patrolling the streets of London. When I'm in my late teens, my mum tells me and my brother a story that centres Reggie's need for solitude, his retreat to the basement of their childhood home, the basement that she alone was allowed to penetrate. Tell us about the war, Daddy, Mum told us she used to beg him, and by all accounts, Grandpa always answered the same way. It's not something you should concern yourself with, pet. Mum was his favourite, and she used to sit at the stool by his workbench in the basement, as close to him as he let her be while he cleaned his carpentry tools. She liked the smell of the oil and watching his fingers move easily to complete this familiar task. She liked the stillness that rustled between them. One evening, when they were sat together, she asked again, "What did you do in the war, Daddy?" She waited for the "nothing you need to know about Annie" and a ruffle of his hand on her head. But instead, he looked at her as if from far away and said quietly, "I pulled out the bodies. I pulled out what was left." And then, unaccountably, he blushed. When Mum told us this story, I could see my tall, thin grandpa, a spare shadow, picking his way through stone, on his own, slow and deliberate, head bowed. Every now and then he'd turn his head to one side like a crow, listening for the noises or silences, keeping away from the lights. Characteristically, my retelling of Mum's story of her dad is about the dangers of speech. Mum always framed his reticence as a way of protecting his family and his favourite, Annie, from the grim horror of war. The blood rushing to his face is as much in shame at breaching his long silence as it is a bodily reaction to remembered horror, helplessness, or survivor guilt. Either way, of course, it's the blush of a hero, of a family man, doing what he had to during the Blitz and long afterwards. The secrets shared in the basement and their affects are entangled with questions of national duty, the sanctioned violence and regulation of the state's representative, Reggie's confrontation with the devastation of bombing raids on London, the wartime conversion from policeman to undertaker. These stories of violence are hard to tell. They slip into Gothic horror so easily because they are whispered, and also or because they are bound up with questions of respectability that have to be safeguarded for the family's own good. I have heard and overheard all my life stories of different kinds of violence that never quite interrupt the main narratives of family. They remain undocumented, either because they mirror or are the law, or were buried by other more sanctioned narratives of gendered and classed progress or loss. And they are gendered stories too, of course, because of the different ways in which women and men are expected to hold together nation and family. War and loss was stitched into Flo's story too. Her 3 older brothers were killed in the Great War, including the dashing but profligate Uncle Charles. He had run away to London when he was just 15, lived hand to mouth until he got lucky, then blown it all on a motorcar that Flo's dad described as bloody ridiculous. Charles would drive up to them at the weekend, back seat filled with presents, all store wrapped and tied off with string. Toot toot and a booming laugh, that's how I'd know he'd arrived, Flo would declare, delighted all over again in her telling. Charlie was always all smiles, and Flo beamed ear to ear too as she remembered how he'd be fussed into the kitchen, usually horribly drab, but now lit up by his presence. Charlie would bounce her on his knee until she was nearly sick, and Flo's mum had to whisk her off with a disapproving tut. Charlie was all hands as well as all smiles. Sausage fingers, his mum called him when he smacked her arse and tickled the kids even though they didn't like it. Flo only had a vague memory of Charles's dad chasing him out of the house with a shovel one weekend when he'd spent a bit too long tucking her up in bed. She overheard her mum following behind them crying, shouting that he'd better not think about coming back anytime soon or she'd put his dirty fingers in the mincer. The army will be the making of him, Flo's dad had said, and that was the end of the conversation. Everything was forgotten when the policeman came to their door. The memory of Charles, all smiles, was restored. There he was, lying dead in a ditch, rictus grin at the end of a bayonet. I remember my grandma talking about her Uncle Charles when I was a child in such saccharine tones that even my earliest memory of her pleasure was suffused with anxious discomfort at its overblown repetition. Charles, the charismatic one who drew everyone in. Charles, the generous, wild, seductive one, like Flo, larger than life. Charles, the one whose wartime death was framed as rehabilitation, that swift page turn through the family album, accompanied by pursed lips and a sigh every time. How to write into my archive of sexual and gendered inheritance a sense of its burial rituals, the memory loss protecting more than its dead. How to write a history of 2 world wars and their devastation in the UK that highlights gendered labour and the consistent presence of obscured, routine violence. How to think a history of gender and class that foregrounds the importance of respectability and ties together Grandpa's blush with Charles's bonhomie. We need the blush and the bravado to continue to fantasise a Britishness favouring the brave. It helps us paper over the cracks that threaten to reveal more foundational horrors at the heart of nationalism. Women do the telling, and their folding in of heroism with the secrets that it consigns to dust with a sigh of relief offers no surprises from a feminist perspective. A whole area of scholarship devotes itself to the gendered and heteronormative, as well as racialised scripts of militarism and nationalism. It tracks the effort required of women to preserve the home front. In the case of Charlie, though, this is a home front from which men's violence can and must be excised, precisely because he does not return. Yet, of course, many women benefited financially from widows' pensions and may have breathed secret or shared sighs of relief at the space that men's absence opened up. How might we tell stories of the gendered ambivalence about men's return from the war or its clean-up operations? How might we represent our inheritance of women's relief as well as sadness when men failed to return? I have Grandma preparing in her imagination. Flo had the meters of black silk for her funeral dress ready. She would cut it plainly, but to flatter her. A top layer of tulle adding texture without too much cost. And of course a hat, plain too, but with a thicker net veil that she would likely bead in the early hours of her sorrow. But though he went out night after night during the Blitz, Reg came home night after night too, and by the end of the war she had added his survival to the long list of reasons she resented him. Reg continued to disappoint Flo in this strand of my family's story. While the war she lived through was marked by men's failure to return, Reg kept turning the key in the suburban domestic lock. I write their relationship in wartime as marked by that disappointment, though perhaps it's me who, more than Flo, likes imagining her guilty pleasure at Grandpa's demise. But I also want to protect my grandma from the critical gaze that saw Reg as henpecked and depicted her as an insatiable nag in ways that threatened to break through that prized respectability of their home. This is another reason why violence bubbles through my social realist depiction and why Reg's blush can't quite protect his favoured daughter. Because violence also took more palpable and present forms in the Croydon family home my mum grew up in. And it's the only violence that forms a direct part of her storytelling. Affable Grandpa beat his son Glyn thoroughly and carefully for most of his youth. He would take off his belt when he got home and chase him around the house till he had him cornered. If it took him a long time to catch him, it was the buckle end. The twins and Grandma told him not to run, but he always did. The one respite was when the children were evacuated to second cousins in Wales during the Blitz. There were, of course, plenty of explanations for Grandpa's violence if you looked for them. No one at work to recognise his talents, no one at home to big him up so he wouldn't have to do it himself. Maybe he looked at Glyn and couldn't bear to witness the lost promise of boyhood. Or maybe he felt he needed to train him to expect to be obliterated in the world. May as well start now. We could give Reg a wounded heart, a youth where he had got used to the same banal brutality, give him the unconscious daddy complex he'd been denied. Certainly, that was the way Mum told the story, searching for an explanation that let him still be hers. But the truth that both Glyn and Reg knew, even if the others didn't, was that Grandpa beat his son because he could. Because he liked it. He was good at it. It was his due. We have to imagine the scene because its banality is beyond official documentation. None of the explanations I include in my retelling of my mum's story stretch the truth, They're all plausible and echo the histories of pride and sorrow etched into masculinity, its successes and failures across aspirant generations. There are many ways to retell violence, to limn its place and its status as open secret within families. Reg is both diminished and diminishing. Flo is both vengeful and compliant. Violence and fantasies of violence suffuse my familial stories, but the ways in which I receive these tales are also shot through with my own queer feminist desires. I narrate Flo's telling of her Uncle Charlie's tale to highlight the sexual violence that lies at its heart, and also the heart of gendered nation and its ways of memorialising. I try to flesh out Reg's embodied uncertainty in his relationship to his favoured daughter. But I am brought up short by tales about Reg's violence towards his son, a violence I simply don't want to give a history, don't want to slip into justification or fictionalisation. I receive these stories as the girl who wants to have and be grandma, the girl who wants to be and console grandpa, and the woman, perhaps the girl too, who refuses to mystify violence as part of a historical narrative and wants instead to revisit the multiple scenes of its repetition. I want to be left with its brutal truth. The genre of inheritance. Giving Reg a story fleshes out his bare bones with what I hope can be read as empathy, while still holding him to account for familial violence. The story I give Reg suggests a context he otherwise lacks, a social history of economic migration and insecure nationalist participation. I recounted Grandma's ambivalence with elements of the Gothic, a touch of the melodramatic perhaps. I play with genre because that feels true to the ways I was told these family stories, and thus true to the memory archive I'm charting or curating. My mum's tale of her parents meeting and moving to England is told from deep within the satisfactions of the romance. I tell the story of wooing grandma through fairy tales I otherwise find alienating. Readers of a similar age and location to me might also recognise the oblique allusion to the children's story of an ice queen offering orientalised Turkish delights in the world behind the back of the cupboard when I describe sitting among grandma's dresses. Towards the end of Grandma Was a Dancer, I introduce a dash of holiday farce to humanise Flo and Reg, to give them a relationship bound by their children's choices in turn. Flo and Reg would arrive the day after Mum and Dad had left, just in case the New Haven to Dieppe ferry was cancelled. They'd get the bus from the station and walk up the steep hill to the house in Brighton, laughing like naughty children as they fumbled with the keys, saying shh, shh to each other for no reason. They quickly established a routine. If the weather was fine, they'd get the bus to the beach for the day, making a picnic from the things Mum had left for them in the larder. Or they'd read in my dad's study and then have tea on the back patio with a slice of vanilla sponge. This is the life. It doesn't get better than this, Reg would say every time, and Flo found she didn't mind. They brought their own sheets to put on the double bed and made sure they left the house exactly as it had been when they arrived. That was a challenge for Flo, who would have liked to scrub that kitchen with bleach and clear out the cupboards. Do you really think Dad didn't know? I asked Mum. If he did, he never said anything. Nancy K. Miller has written persuasively of memoir as feminised genre. But this rehabilitation has come at the expense, I think, of exploring what it means to write history through memory and fiction in a range of different genres. And it's the work of these differences that I'm interested in here. telling the story of Flo's move from Wales to England as a romance narrative, rather than, say, a horror story, produces a distinctive history that folds in the heteronormative with ease. For example, the story of Flo and Reg staying at the family home in Brighton without leaving any traces of their visit generates humour as well as the anxiety that so often comes with the sitcom. No one is innocent within its world. But that genre also allows a certain rapprochement between Reg and Flo, a getting along or rubbing along, one excised by melodrama, realism or horror. Playing with genre allows me to juxtapose the stories that make up my archive. Genres, as we know, are not equal. Some are more unreliable than others. The romance narratives of a teenager are likely to fade, as are the love stories of the young married couple hoping for fortunes to open up as they head for the disaffections or banalities of middle age. Genres have a tone that insists, that tells us how we're supposed to read the story as comedy or tragedy. They give us advance warning of how the story will end and how we're supposed to feel about it. Genre thus opens expectations that can be satisfied or thwarted. Genre proffers an open narrative secret that allows the reader to share in the knowledge of how the tale will turn out. The war story and the realist drama are expected to linger, describing history and the present in more verifiable ways, while melodrama is by definition overwrought, suffused with untrustworthy femininity, open to being discredited. Grandma Was a Dancer thus not only dramatises different ways of telling family stories, it also asks what kind of reader or listener receives them. Readers also have genre preferences. In other words, a good war story or a travelogue may keep one person turning the page. Another may be unmoved by melodrama while secretly enjoying a bodice ripper. Yet another reader might be disturbed by my use of the romance genre to introduce my queer desire for grandma, or, on the contrary, they may wish that it occupied a more central place in the story. A reader might be enraged at my tinkering with a heroic war story, or relieved that otherwise hidden violence seeps through all the genres. Those reading protocols, to use Samuel Delaney's phrase, including the affects that guide the reading of a disappointing farce or an inauthentic travelogue, are of course interpretations in their own right of Reg and Flo's stories. They tell us something about how you, as well as I, inherit histories of gender, class and sexuality. Drawing on particular genres has also allowed me to try and scupper their expectations. It's allowed me to stage interruption through or by combining features of more than one genre. Combining a war story with melodrama unearths the former's half-buried knowledges and challenges its heroic arcs. The Gothic or horror genre, with its hidden truths a reader anticipates, opens up space for bringing buried sexual and gendered violence to the fore without interrupting the plot. Adding a touch of the uncanny, Charlie's too brittle laugh and our readerly knowledge that something is amiss will most certainly come to light, can force a reconsideration of plot and thus also received history. And even as a child, I wanted to interrupt the romance tale of Flo and Reg that my mum told, to mark myself as a desiring subject and reject the heteronormative gendering that can remain so easily unquestioned in accounts of sexual progress over the last century. My desire for grandma highlights the queerness of the past as well as the queerness of the present, even if I have to time travel through the wardrobe to rescue her. To play with genres is thus to refuse singular histories, singular affects, and singular modes of reading. Working across genres, I can inherit a past that refuses to move on from the misery of marriage, the stoicism of survival, the enduring capriciousness of male violence and its cover-ups. But that is also a past in which the pleasures of walking or dancing are folded into their plot's uneven rhythms. I can give Flo a story of her own that doesn't stop at the genres through which she is remembered or imagined. Indeed, I like to think that my fictionalising can allow Flo to make use of genre in her own right. At the end of the story, Flo takes a boat to New Zealand on her own some 10 years before going with Reg to visit my auntie Sheila in Australia. And here I finally allow her to demonstrate knowledge of other people's stories and a creative relationship to her own past. The Suez Canal was open and Flo took all the port trips along the way. Casablanca had been her favourite film and now she got to go there herself. Flo kept to herself for the most part, devouring novels, walking along the decks in all weathers. There was an after-dinner dance on Saturday night and Flo always got dressed up. She let herself be twirled from first to last dance, remembering the pleasure of moving her long legs, but was surprised to find she missed Grandpa's easy rhythm. At dinner, Flo liked to play a game and become someone she was not. No point in trying to spin a yarn about being a doctor or a writer for which she had no reference points. But she knew enough about being a teacher, because Anne and Sheila were both teachers, and about wartime ambulance driving, as she'd heard other women talking about it, to be able to tell a convincing tale about who she wasn't. She was careful to cover her boasts about rescues of the injured or the reformation of difficult children with the right amount of self-deprecation. Such accomplishments were always team efforts, she reassured her listener. She found she liked telling these stories that other people's lives felt closer to hers in the telling. In pretending to be an exhausted teacher, she finally empathised with her daughter's choices. In her newfound role as wartime rescuer, Flo pulled bodies from the rubble along with Reg, felt both his and her necessary dissociation in her body as an unsentimental bond. Flo had always been persuasive of being someone she wasn't, and these not-so-tall tales were no exception. At points, she really did have the feeling of having been a teacher or a driver. These weren't uncertain memories, dangerous fantasies, or outright lies. They were part of the making of possibility that took the past and made something new and vibrant in the present tense of storytelling, honouring the work she had always done to create space for the accomplishments of others, whether they appreciated it or not, she remarked to herself wryly. Her sincere falsehoods, her reward for all those years of making do and mending, opened up a space and time in which she got to be whoever she wanted for as long as she liked. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. That was wonderful. So interesting to hear more about your work and your short story writing in particular. We've got about 25 minutes for questions now. Would anyone like to get us started? Craig?
I'd like to ask a question about Reg.
Yes.
When we talk about the archive, when we talk about kind of sort of narrative privilege, we often talk about, you know, those that are unrepresented and are oppressed by that lack of representation, be that archival silence or you know, stories not being written about them. And we've got an example of Reg, as you characterised it, someone who is in a sense silenced. His stories are silenced. They're very marginal little bits of narrative information. But he's not your kind of classical narratively oppressed subject. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you could talk about how I mean, is Reg you know, a kind of narratively oppressed kind of figure, even though he's also a sort of a fairly, you know, nasty patriarch in some ways?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think I think part of the difficulty that I was grappling with, and I think I've heard other people who do this sort of work talking about too, is that if you're talking about the gaps in the archive or the excision from the archive of marginalised characters, which in a way it constitutes the kind of focus of most critical fabulation or speculative fictionalising, for good reason. What can end up happening is that the dominant, or what we imagine to be the dominant, becomes, if you like, kind of re-abstracted. So one of the things I was really keen not to do in my own engagement with Flo and with Reg was to only tell a story, contradictory, fictionalised and messed with, of Flo, because when you do that, of course, you are also telling a story about Reg. It's just that it doesn't have the kind of detail, and therefore the likelihood of remaking him into a simple masculine figure, presumed authority, presumed wartime hero, presumed problematic depending on where you're located. And I think that's difficult, because it means then that it's hard to think about what it might mean to be accountable for those ambivalences of masculinity, right? I'm not trying to make him accountable, I'm making us accountable for that inheritance, right? In other words, the violence of him as a class transitional-ish, I mean, we're the class transitional ones, but for him, the ambivalence of being on the margins, but also using that experience as a way of making himself central within the home, while also using gendered tropes to make sure that he didn't have to do the same level of labour, enable him in a way, like they do men in those contexts, to kind of flourish in a specific way that doesn't need to tell those other stories of ambivalence. And I think that's, so I wouldn't, in a way, I suppose it's not so much about who is or isn't oppressed then, it's about the dynamics of gender, class, race and politics that we inherit, that are always in play, aren't they? And I guess that sense of compensation is partly what I'm telling the story of Reg through, right?
Yeah.
Dad, disappointed, move, dominant wife, various kinds of modes. Of course, what we're dealing with in the UK now is that framing of not just masculinity, but certainly masculinity as white masculinity as marginal in ways that, of course, also participate in violent attachments. And I want to provide a history of my family that says that that's always been available. That it doesn't take much for that to attach to a right wing. It doesn't take much for that to attach to beating your son. It doesn't, and that they're linked, and that disappointment has a history. White disappointment, white masculine disappointment, has a 20th century history. Particularly for class transitional subjects, that makes the right always amenable, because it provides a belonging you don't otherwise have, right? That's why it's important he was a policeman. He's the, So in the longer work, both in the story, but in the work of the archive as a whole, that question of needing to move beyond thinking about oppressed and marginal characters or voices or identities is significant for being able to tell that story.
Yeah, great, thank you so much.
Does that make sense?
That does, it's really useful.
Thank you for your talk. I had a question about, I guess, if you've seen in your work or in other people's work who do similar things, this generational distance where it's the grandchildren who can kind of look at a story and then ask the more critical questions, almost like the innocent skips a generation somehow, where you know, the idea of the mom being like, yeah, grandma was a dancer, and the kids are like, right,
Mhm.
not a dancer.
Dancer.
So I was wondering if that's also part of it, having that distance to re-adultify.
I'm sure that must be right. And also to be able to then, in part I think because you've then got more than one set of narratives. So maybe part of that is also that methodologically that distance, even if I wouldn't want to say I really have a distance to these stories because obviously I'm very invested in all of them. But the difference it does make methodologically is I also hear my mum's stories of grandma, of course, and grandpa. And I hear, you know, I think I was 11 when Reg died. My grandma had died, Flo had died earlier. But I still, of course, you know, I'd spent holidays with them and various things, and they had, so I already had stories Flo told, or not Reg obviously, but Flo told and my mum told. So you already then, as the grandchild, have the contradictions that you're being expected to make sense of. And so in some senses I wanted to use that methodology, which is to say, look, you know, we all already know that these narratives are contradictory because there's never a seamlessness in terms of how they're told. And maybe that generational distance, it's less about distance and more about the accumulation of multiple and you know, it's much more likely then that they're going to be contradictory, and it's like, you know, so that me and my brother get to say, you've known him how long? You know, or like, wait, hang on a minute, what do you mean, you know, she was bailed out, or how did that work? And like, wait, hang on a minute, what else was going on? And then of course as an adult, reading the social histories of South Wales and Prohibition, I'm able to kind of go, oh, that's interesting, yeah, okay, so that was probably taking place somewhere rather different from the story I was told, right? And so in that sense, research, like the history of Prohibition in the Welsh Valleys, which is a great read, is less about setting the story straight. So it's not about me going, oh my God, that would never have happened. And more about saying, okay, that's interesting. So what's the investment in telling the story in this way, not in this way? What is it that's being hidden? What is it that, and hence in that instinctive way that children and young adults have, and adolescents, of the eyebrow raising of like, dancer? You know, that would allow you to that in a way show. The other thing I wanted to kind of show was the ways in which, you know, 15-year-olds are the very best historians. Because of like, what? You know? Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Susie?
I guess I'm really interested in how you undertaking this project has impacted your role within the family, and I suppose it's a question about how others in your family have responded to this project and how you feel it's impacted your position or your role within the family now.
It's super. I don't know if any of the rest of you do this work. It's complicated and unresolved. So I interviewed. My dad's now 92 and my mum's 89, and I did a lot of the interviewing of them about 5 or 6 years ago when I realised partly it was simply a personal thing, which was like, oh, I would quite like to have their voices, but also would like these stories a little bit more fleshed out and so on. And then looked at the archive material and so on, before they forget where it is, before they, you know, and so on. And then also remembered all of the other stories that I'd been told when I was a child. And I don't think it changed my location in the family, but it did make me much more sympathetic in a sense to my parents and where it was that they both came from, particularly my mum in terms of the in terms of the moves that her family had to make to survive. There's another set of stories which partly about my dad, which tried to make sense of his own political attachments that I started to do when I found out that he had voted Brexit in the MEP elections, and also Brexit Party, and also voted Leave. And tried to make sense, not so much of that, although that was that moment of kind of like, what the hell is happening, you know, but also to make sense of my surprise. So more to make sense of like, well, lots of people did, didn't they? That's how it came about. That's why we're in here, this mess. So it shouldn't be, the idea of it being surprise is I think also a kind of white fantasy of my own, which is a white middle class fantasy, which is kind of like, in what ways has this right-wingness not been central to everything I've ever inherited, and what does it mean, what is my surprise about? So in other